Time to talk about aquatic biomes. The word biome tends to be actually a term to describe terrestrial systems. It probably should more accurately be written aquatic communities, but many books now are using the word biome for terrestrial or aquatic communities. So, at any rate, aquatic ecosystems have different rules. While on land, climate determines what grows where. In the water, there's four factors: oxygen levels, temperature levels, light intensity, and nutrient levels, which are different. Unlike land, oxygen levels in water can vary drastically. Generally speaking, especially if water is sitting still, oxygen is highest at the surface and lowest at the depths. Um, in general, if water temperatures exceed 100 Fahrenheit, fish cannot be present because they'll suffocate. Warm water does not carry any oxygen. So, not only do oxygen levels vary by depth in a lake, the warmer the water is in a lake during the summer, the less oxygen the water holds. In the wintertime, water in a lake actually holds more oxygen than in the summer. So, in streams and flowing water systems, oxygen levels are more homogeneous because of the churning of the water. Temperature. Standing water has a vertical stratification of heat, meaning if you've ever swam in a lake, the warmest water's at the surface and the coldest water's down below. Flowing water systems like streams and rivers, water's more evenly mixed in terms of temperature. Uh, Terrestrial systems can change up to 100 degrees in a single 24-hour period, whereas aquatic systems will change maybe a couple of degrees in a 24-hour period. It's a very different experience between the two. Light intensity in between terrestrial and aquatic is very different. On land, light intensity is pretty much equal at the top of a hill and at the bottom of the hill. Whereas in water, light may only penetrate 20 feet in a murky lake. In absolutely crystal clear water, light won't penetrate more than 600 feet. So in aquatic systems, beyond 600 feet, you don't find much life because there's no light coming in to feed the food chains. Um, and then, light areas of water that get light are said to be photic. Areas of water due to depth that don't get light are said to be aphotic, meaning without light. Nutrient levels, ironically, on land, nutrient levels that are high contribute to species diversity. They enhance it. On the other hand, nutrient levels that are high in aquatic systems cause little or no species diversity. Uh, Water that is too high in nutrients is called eutrophic. Water that's low in nutrients is called oligotrophic. Drinking water is oligotrophic. It is very low in nutrients, and that's what makes it drinkable. This is oligotrophic water here, low in nutrients, and therefore drinkable. This water is really high in nutrients. There's a lot of phosphate and a lot of nitrate in the water, which causes a massive algae growth. That water is totally unsuitable for drinking. Um, Nutrient levels in aquatic systems are completely different than they are in terrestrial systems. So while in terrestrial systems it's climate that determines distribution, in aquatic systems it's oxygen, temperature, light intensity, and nutrients. So let's go now to the freshwater communities. Freshwater communities that are shallow tend to be, we call them wetlands. Wetlands can be bogs, which are standing water wetlands, or they can be marshes, fens, or swamps, which tend to be flowing water systems. Wetlands usually are abundant in wildlife, lots of fish, lots of insects, lots of amphibians. By definition, a wetland has at least some standing water during the year and at least some wetland plants and animals growing in it permanently. Um, Wetlands usually have rich soils, and that's why they've been drained. In Missouri, we have less than 2% of our wetlands remaining that was once here. It's been drained for agriculture use. So this is a salt marsh where a river is zigzagging on its way to the sea. This is shallow and you can walk through it. This is a bog and not recommended to walk through this. It's usually a pond. It's pretty deep and it's getting overgrown with vegetation. This is floating vegetation in the bog. So let's talk about ponds and lakes. Let's see. Let's go to more here. This is a typical alpine pond or lake. Lilies are growing in the pond. Ponds have and lakes have the rules are highest oxygen at the surface, highest temperature at the surface. And then as you go down in the water, water temperatures go down, and you'd think oxygen would go up, but it usually doesn't because animals down below are using the oxygen up. So this is a mountain lake. That's an alpine lake in Glacier National Park as we were heading up to Grinnell Glacier, which was up there. Um, Absolutely crystal clear water. So most of this lake was photic. It got a light. And this is another alpine lake in Glacier National Park. The water was almost all photic. There were no depths where light didn't penetrate. And this is another alpine lake. These lakes are all oligotrophic. Water is all drinkable. We don't need to go through all of the littoral and the limnetic zones in all these lakes. We don't need to get that crazy. Streams and rivers have flowing water. Things tend to be more evenly mixed in terms of temperature and nutrient availability. Rivers are usually oligotrophic when they're near their headwater where their birthplace is, but as they go downstream, they become more and more eutrophic as animals pee in them and poop in them and they pick up nutrients. Temperatures can fluctuate but tend to be even on a given day because of the churning of the river. But in the winter, temperatures can be cold in the water, and in the summer, the temperatures are warm. And this is Blue Nile Falls in Africa after heavy rains. This kind of action super oxygenates the water. This is looking at the Mississippi River, typically at normal water levels. In other words, not flood stage. This is the Missouri River here flowing in here at St. Louis. This is the Illinois River coming in, and this is the Mississippi coming in. This was the flood of 93. You can see how much flooding there was on the Illinois, the Mississippi, and the Missouri as the rivers met each other and flowed downstream. This is the birthplace of a lot of rivers in the world. This is a glacier, and this is the meltwater at the base of the glacier that's running downstream. This is typical. Now, this is an oligotrophic stream that's running down from highlands. The water is very clear and it's drinkable. This is the opposite now. This is a eutrophic canal, which is way too high in nutrients. The water is not drinkable and probably has almost no life in it because of the algal bloom. Now that brings us to the estuaries. Estuaries are loaded with life. This is the mouth of the Amazon River. As the river meets the sea, the water becomes semi-salty. They call it brackish. This is the birthplace of a lot of fish and a lot of shorebirds where they go here to breed. The Mississippi River down in New Orleans is a very productive ecosystem. The mouths of rivers have tidal action. So this is at low tide. At high tide, the water will be all the way up to the tree line here. So unlike up headwater regions of rivers, which tend to flow pretty evenly, as you meet the ocean, you have tidal action. And this is a satellite image of the Colorado River estuary, where the Colorado River is supposed to meet the sea. It's just that it does not usually meet it anymore because the entire Colorado River is pumped out. This here is the Mississippi River Delta at the Gulf of Mexico as the water is flowing out to the sea. So estuaries tend to be really productive regions on Earth where rivers meet seas and the water goes from freshwater to saltwater. Now let's talk about the intertidal zone. This is a typical intertidal zone. The tide will come up and cover almost the entire beach up to the vegetation line, and then it'll go back out at low tide. It does that twice a day. Each day the water will come up, it will go down, it will come up, it will go down. And so any animals and plants that live in this area really got it rough because they're underwater half the time and out of the water half the time. This is a really hard place to walk. It's a muddy intertidal zone that you often find in estuaries. It's just muck, and these are tube worms sticking out of the muck. This is typical sea life in an intertidal pool at low tide. And here is a typical intertidal zone that you would see like on a almost on a Southern California beach, although I don't think this is Southern California. But you can see where the tides reach up here on the beach. And this is me on a rocky intertidal zone in Northern California, sitting in a place where if I had sat there for another 3 hours, I would have probably been underwater. So intertidal zones are the place between the high and the low tide marks at the beach. The coastal zone, that's the kelp forest, is different than a coral reef. Kelp forest grows in areas of the oceans where the temperature of the water is less than 70 Fahrenheit, usually less than 65. So here we have kelp. Kelp can get over 100 feet tall from the ocean floor reaching to the surface. It goes up and down with the tides. It's an extremely productive system. There's lots of fish. There are whales. This is low tide, where the kelps are actually laying on the surface. At high tide, they'll be standing straight up in the deeper water. There are things like sea otters and sea lions in this kind of water, seagulls, feeding in the water. It's a very productive ecosystem. The otter is a keystone species in the kelp forest of Southern California because it eats urchins, which will destroy the kelp. So if you take uh, these little sea otters out of the system, the uh, urchins will eat all the kelp, and then the whole forest disappears, which is exactly what happened when we killed almost all the sea otters about 100 years ago. Then that brings us to the coral reef. Coral reef grows in water that's at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Uh, it is the most productive ecosystem in the world. You have a really rich growth of coral and invertebrates like starfish, along with many different kinds of fish like these anthias. The famous clownfish and anemone associations are there. This is a really high population density of anthias over a stony coral region. That's a lionfish, which is actually an invasive species on the Atlantic coast right now. And then there's a rather rare soft coral dendrophyte, probably, that you really don't even, it doesn't look pink in its normal environment because it grows deep down in the ocean. Somebody was shining a flashlight on it, or the camera flash shone light on it, and it looked red. If you turn the light off, it looks black because there's no red light that penetrates this deep in the ocean. So coral reef is an incredibly productive ecosystem, and it actually is under assault by coral bleaching. And we don't know exactly why it's bleaching, but the Great Barrier Reef is bleaching, and much of the Caribbean is bleaching right now. Then there's the open sea zone, which is both mostly aphotic, but some of it's photic. The upper 600 feet is photic, and then below 600 feet is aphotic, meaning it gets no light. There are some things in the open ocean, but not much. This is a catenophore growing in the open ocean. You do find sea turtles swimming in the open ocean, and there are man-o-war jellyfish floating in the open ocean, and there are great white sharks occasionally swimming in the open ocean, but there's just not a lot out there. The upper 600 feet has light, but not a lot of nutrients, so there's just not a lot of a food chain out there. And then below 600 feet, there is no light, so there's really not much of a food chain at all. So the open ocean is not the way, it's not the way you probably think it is. It's kind of a desert of conditions, and there's just not a lot of life out there. Then there's the benthic ocean, which is the deep sea depths, which is kind of a wasteland in a lot of areas. It's just a sandy or muddy bottom with trash on it now because we've been dropping our trash in the ocean for years. But in areas where you find deep sea vents, you find this tube worms and fish, and it's just really a tangled mess of life growing on chemosynthesis. There are bacteria that chemosynthesize the volcanic vent gases, and then they in turn are fed upon by plankton, which are fed upon by small fish, which are fed upon, and tube worms, which are fed upon by bigger fish and crabs and stuff. It's just crazy. It's a crazy ecosystem. It's not supported by light. It's supported by chemosynthesis at the vents. May have been the birthplace of life on Earth, hard to say. So that concludes the aquatic communities for this discussion. Oh, one last thing, you may want to look at this table here, which summarizes the differences and similarities between the different aquatic communities.